And that's where the empathy piece, you mentioned empathy before, and of course that's part of our title, Nurture Little Learners, Big Hearts, a teacher's guide to nurturing empathy and equity in early childhood. So we do see empathy as central to the process. But if that child is in an environment where they can more freely play with children who are different than them, and here I'm just talking about white children, then it begins to at least perhaps counterbalance some of what the prejudice that they're picking up. And that goes back to what I was saying right at the very beginning of how prejudice develops in the minds of very, very young babies and toddlers and young children.
Welcome, everybody. This podcast is all about you. Why knowledge matters. Welcome. I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Randy Ross, to the show. Thank you so much for your time, Randy Ross, for joining us and to really talk about Little Learners, Big Hearts that you co-authored with your colleagues.
Well, my background, I'm technically retired now, so I'm not working other than writing. But my background for many years, decades, has been in the field of equity and diversity. I worked on issues of school climate, improving school climate, and more specifically on bullying issues. So when Jill and Chris were thinking about this, about writing a book about early childhood racism and equity in early childhood, Jill thought of me. We've been friends for a while, and she asked me to write a chapter for the book on bullying issues among young children. So I wrote that one chapter, and then that one chapter led to another chapter and another chapter, and I ended up being the second co-author on the book, having written probably maybe a third of it, maybe a little more. So that's how I first got involved in writing this book, and it's been a little over 2 years now that we've been working as a team on the book. It, of course, came out in February. Um, but that's a little bit of the background.
Very important, especially for listeners, so you can get a copy of Little Learners Big Hearts on solutiontree.com. So please just get a copy right now in order really to improve your school climate and really make it a tangible impact for early schoolers, right? And what I really love about the book is you really give us tools that can really also be replicated for higher grades and even in companies with people. Really, it's such a powerful concept. And so let's just dive into the heart of the matter, because there's an acronym and I really appreciate that. You call it Heart Plus. So please introduce to us what you mean by Heart Plus.
Well, that acronym actually was developed by Orinthia Harris. So I can certainly talk about it a little bit, but it's not the main part of what I contributed to the book. But its heart is hope, education, meaning self-education, um, recognition, no, HEA, acknowledgement, recognition,
Exactly.
and teaching. And then the plus is there because every different school system or early childhood center has a different context, and that's really referring to the community that the program is existing within. So that's what we mean by Heart Plus. My work, I would say, if I'm going to connect it to any particular aspect of that, would probably be in the self education or the E and in the A of acknowledgement. That's kind of where my focus has been. Yeah, I would say that taking that acronym and then looking at some of the letters, that's my work has been mostly focused, I'd say, on the acknowledgement and the recognition piece.
Why do you think equity and equality still is so underrepresented to some extent in schools? Why is that?
Well, to be really honest, it's because those who have privilege in our society and in other societies don't want to acknowledge or recognize that there's something unequal and inequitable going on in their schools. So I would just talk specifically about schools here. And I don't think this is just in the United States. I think it exists in certainly in most European and not just European countries in South America. You've got ruling classes and wealthy classes in in India where there's a caste system. So I'm very you know aware. My background actually, I have a master's degree in anthropology many years ago. But that kind of has been, I would say that that background for me um, plus other life experiences have given me the broader context of the cultural competence aspect of what we emphasize. But to answer your question, I think it's because those who have power or privilege really don't want to acknowledge what's wrong with the way that they're approaching education.
Yeah, and really, with this book, you really wrote an important piece in order to really contribute to the positive development of all little learners. And I think that is what I really appreciate in this book is that you take a topic that usually is not necessarily taught in preschoolers and elementary school. Why do you think it is so important that we actually start early in life when it comes to anti-racism education, for example?
Well, I think one of the answers to that question, and I think there are several, but one of the answers is what we've learned from neuroscientists in the last several decades. And this was a part of the research that I did. I knew a little bit about it before I started working on the book, but I really dug into some of the research that neuroscientists have come up with about the origins of prejudice. And so, if I can say this in a very simple way, in the when a baby's developing brain, the baby has a need, or the baby's brain, the baby has a need to categorize experience. So that categorization may be and that's all just using senses, sensory input. So it could be, mother's face or mother's voice versus grandmother's voice. It could be hot versus cold. So using auditory and visual senses. I mean, auditory and touch senses. But when you get into the visual senses, one of the things that an infant's brain is developing is categories of what they're seeing. So the normal process is for a developing brain to categorize experience. Okay, so I'm taking that to the step of, and we'll just for the moment talk about race and skin color, really, not even just race, but skin color. So the brain, the infant's developing brain is noticing or may notice if there's a diversity in their experience different skin colors of adults and others around them. So that's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the recognition. But then society and family and community come in and begin to give emphasis and positive versus negative, and that's a little too simplified, but just to make the point here, to give positive or negative weight to different categories. When that happens, it begins to be the root of the prejudice. Now, it doesn't have to be prejudice. It can be, oh, everybody's different. Look at all these differences. Isn't that wonderful? If that's what the family and the early experiences in schooling, which is preschool, and because we go up to grade 3. Early childhood is birth to grade 3 or birth to age 8. Um, so we're very aware that we need to design our education for young children to counterbalance the inputs of negativity. So, for let's say for white children, that's really the emphasis. For children of color, it becomes because there's this internalization of negative feelings about their own racial group or their own skin color group because at a very young age, it's not so much about race as it is about just the appearance that's different. Um, so what we're trying to do is lay out the ways in which some children need to be positive identity needs to be reinforced for them, and for other children it's a matter of helping them see others who look different, white children let's say, seeing that others who look different than their own family or friends or community to honor to see the value. So I mean, if Jill was here, and you can, when you interview Jill, she can make this point. That's one of the reasons that we emphasize the importance of children's literature, because in children's literature there's this idea of windows versus mirrors. So we want white children to be able to look through a window and see others who are different. We want children of color because in children's literature for decades it's mostly been white children in books, um, in children's books. But we want children of color to be able to see themselves in those same books that the white children are looking at. So the white children are looking through a window, and the children of color are looking at a mirror where they're seeing themselves. I know that was a very long explanation, but I hope it was clear what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense, right? And you mention also in the book that usually, let's say, white kids, we have a lot of mirrors, right? That really reinforce us and our self-esteem. And so it's also hard, obviously, for someone like me or you potentially. It all depends, right? To have to some extent even empathy, right? Because if you do not really
Right.
walk in the shoes of someone else, it's really hard unless you actually experience it. So it is certainly a challenge for both sides, right? And so how did you navigate
Mm-hmm.
this thin line as a person, as a white person, and what really made you engage in this conversation? Because it takes a lot of courage. There are even people, and you always have from one extreme to the other, right? Some people even say, well, you're a white person, you should never talk about this, right? And that's why I really thank you, because it's all about improving and making tangible improvements in people's life, and it doesn't matter which color, right? And so thank you for that.
Right. So, are you asking me sort of how this became such an important issue for me? Is that the question that you're asking?
Exactly,
For me
exactly. And
personally,
also in
why
your
how it became
position,
so
right?
important?
And also in your position, right? I think, and it
I just
takes
wanted to clarify
courage.
where the question is.
Yeah.
So, for me personally, I I'm 79 now, so I was very active in the civil rights movement in the 60s. And I came from a family that was unusually progressive in the 1950s in this country. So I had sort of progressive in the sense, particularly around racial issues. So I tell a story in the book about when I was about 7 or 8 years old, and outside playing with a neighbor child, and she used the N word to refer to some young people who were on bikes that we could see from where we were playing, young boys and bicycles, and they were black boys. And she used the N word comment, and I had never heard it and didn't really even know what it meant. And I went home and said to my mother, "Oh, so and so said this," and my mother said, we never use that word in this house. That's a very mean word. And I look back on that as sort of my first memory. I mean, it may have happened, other things may have happened that I don't remember, but that's my first conscious memory of a lesson of anti-racism in my own family. And I tell that story in the book because I think it sort of can model for parents and teachers the need to be very clear, certainly about values. So that's where it started, and through high school, I was even in high school, I was involved in the civil rights movement. When I got to college, I was involved in the civil rights movement. I went south for a year in the '60s. So it's really been a part of my life, in my education and in the way I started teaching, etc. I'm 79, so I would say for, I don't know, 65 years or something, this has been very essential to who I am as a person.
What do you think is the reason that racism is still so prevalent? And even when you think in schools, that even there's not always an awareness also about it and the implication teachers can have on kids. So why is it,
Well,
that it is
so
still
why it's
so
so
prevalent?
prevalent, I think I'll take that part as the question first. Um, I think it's so prevalent because it's the only where I said before, because those who have authority and power and privilege either don't want to make any change or, in a more subtle way, are oblivious to the need for change. And that's where the empathy piece, you mentioned empathy before, and of course, that's part of our title, Nurture Little Learners, Big Hearts, a teacher's guide to nurturing empathy and equity in early childhood. So we do see empathy as central to the process. Um, and of course, I think it's very complicated how we get adults to change and recognize their own, particularly adults who have power, and particularly white parents or white educators, to recognize that they have this privilege and that the ethical and moral approach is to break down that privilege and see the world through the eyes of those who have less privilege. So I think, but also that is part of what we call systemic racism. And there's no question in my mind that in education, we could speak about, lots of other ways in which racism is systemic. But within education, we simply have a set of practices that have gone on for for really hundreds of years, which which have led to the viewpoint that Black children and children of color more broadly um, are less worthy than, less capable than. And those are often unconscious ideas, but they're built into our system of practices. And the best example, there's many examples, but the best example that I have of that is around discipline issues. Um, we know that there's tons of research that shows that children of color, particularly boys, Black boys, and Latino boys, but particularly Black boys, are disciplined at a much higher rate than white boys for the same behaviors. And the lack of the inability for an adult or teacher or an administrator to recognize that is coming from what we call implicit bias. That is, it's the unconscious bias. They don't realize and would not admit that there's some bias going on. But the statistics and the numbers and all the research absolutely shows that that is the case. So we have a system of discipline in schools, and not in all schools, but in many schools, that reinforces that. So a child is thought to be misbehaving, thought to talk back to it, seen as talking back to adults, um, or involved in some kind of an argument with other children, and the adult zeroes in on the Black boy more often, but also Black girls, but more often Black boys, and then the system says, okay, you've been misbehaving, so now you need to be suspended from school. And even worse than that, three or four suspensions. Now we're going to go through an expulsion and we're going to expel you. That process, whatever age we're talking about, whether we're talking about 5 year olds or we're talking about 15 year olds, leads to other behavioral problems. And that's what we call the preschool to prison pipeline, or if we're talking about older children, the school to prison pipeline. So I'll stop there because there's a lot more that could be said about that process, but I've tried to connect the dots of how systemic racism and implicit bias or unconscious bias work to impact the lives and futures of children of color, particularly boys.
And I think you mentioned in the book how important it is really to reinforce this positive self-esteem, right, for marginalized children, right? So let's talk a little bit about how you actually do it in practice and what you actually elaborate in the book.
So self-esteem is part of this identity piece that I mentioned before, but we can still separate it out. So what does self-esteem mean? It means having confidence in oneself, that I can learn, that I can get along with other children, that I have talents or some that I have value. That's really what self-esteem means. So what we try to emphasize, and this is not just about racial differences, this is also, it really brings in cultural differences as well. So um, if a child comes into a school environment, when the home environment, let's say, I'm very familiar with the Indian, South Asian Indian culture because my ex-husband is from India, so I'm very familiar with that culture. So a child comes into a school which is which has, or let's say a preschool, we'll just talk about young children or first or second grade, which has nothing in the classroom or in the curriculum that reflects their own background, whether it's pictures on the walls, whether it's books, whether it's food that they're being served, playthings. In preschools, there's often like a dress up corner. So, one of the things, I'm just using one example here, one of the things that we recommended, this happens to be a section that I wrote, is that as much as possible, teachers should set up a classroom and a curriculum having elements that reflect the home cultures of the children in their classrooms. So I'll give you a very specific example, not about children from India. I visited a preschool in San Francisco, which has a very, very high population of Asian children, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino children. And in that classroom, in the kitchen area, preschool classrooms often have like a little kitchen area. I saw boxes of food. I mean, there was no food in them, but empty boxes um, that had Chinese lettering on them, that were Chinese foods that would be common and for children coming from a Chinese American family. That's creating the familiarity and the reflection, and so then there's a connection. So how does that reinforce self-esteem? Well, by reflecting a child's when you don't reflect a child's home background, the child begins to feel like other, or like there's something wrong with them and their background. When you reflect in the classroom through curriculum, through pictures, etc., the child's background, then it reinforces the self esteem rather than breaking down the self esteem.
To me, actually, the US, even though there are problems as anywhere, but the US to me is actually really the testimony of how multiculturalism is really enhancing basically almost everything, especially also the culture. When we look at the scientific advancement that emerged in the US, and that's precisely because the US was always able to bring all these different perspectives into the equation in order to build something new. Right now we have all this crazy technology that is by and large really emerged in the US, and because it's really this kind of melting pot, right, that really helps and facilitates this encounter of different culture, different perspective that really makes it success, right? It really stands on this success. But on the other hand, you still have this somehow denial of this multiculturalism, and even certain books are banned. I mean, I from Ronald Takaki is also a really influential historian. He unfortunately passed away, but in certain states, his books are banned. So, why do you think is that? I mean, you touched a little bit on that, but I just want to know what is it that
Well, I'll start with the problem with this concept of the melting pot. The really, when we talk about the melting pot, the what it actually means in reality is that those who come from a different cultural background are expected to assimilate. So it's not really about um, this beautiful mixture. It's more about how do we bring people who immigrate to this country to assimilate into the white norm. What is the white norm? So I think it's Takaki, and it's many years since I read his work, but I think he talks a lot about the melting pot, and this is an old metaphor, but about a salad, which is where you've got the tomatoes and the lettuce and the cucumbers and the this and the that, um, and they're mixed together, but they maintain their own flavor and individuality. I'm not sure, but I think it was Takaki who came up with that metaphor, and I think that gets us closer, but not all the way, to understanding the reality. So the reality is what you say, which is that it's a multicultural world, multiracial, multicultural. A lot of us use this expression, a multiracial democracy, which recognizes that there are differences, um, and beautiful differences among within the population. But then there is that voice, and sometimes it's a very conservative voice that's spoken, outspoken, and that's obviously part of the politics that we have had in this country very recently, and hopefully not too much in the future. But anyway, um, that is very dominant. And for people who consider themselves, open minded, there's still that unconscious bias around difference. So for example, I don't know what country you're from, but just speak with an accent compared to my accent, or, the way, the majority of people in this country would speak. And when somebody speaks with an accent, there is an accent compared to, you know, the normative speech of English in this country. It triggers in the unconscious mind this concept of difference. And difference, as I said right at the beginning, difference can be fine. There doesn't need to be any value of positive or negative, or there can even be positive because it can arouse curiosity and, interest and wanting to learn more. But there can also be a negative to that sense of other. So there's a lot of triggers to that othering process, which is another word that people often use, is othering. Um, so I think it's a combination of power and privilege in the system, but it's also this other at a more individual level, the implicit bias that's an unconscious bias against those who are different than oneself. I don't know if that helps, if I'm answering your question directly.
you do. And the way I read the book is also you really take an empowering approach. It's not singling out a certain color and saying like you have to feel bad about the fact that you are this and that color, but that we take to some extent this responsibility. And I really borrow the term of Stephen Covey, who really, coins it as your ability to really respond to a certain matter, right? And I think that we can all become really allies to help mitigate this problem of racism and making people feel bad about their self, about their colors, right? It's really detrimental ultimately for our society and for really the peace. And I think oftentimes we take for granted what we have, especially in the Western world, of democracy, of freedom of speech, of really basic human rights, right? And so that's also something that I really heard, that you take this empowering approach. Why is that you take this empowering uh, approach and not saying, well, you have to single out a certain, you know, skin color because they have somehow done wrong?
So I think you used the word accountability uh, early in what you were just discussing, and I think that that's important. What we tried to do in the book, and this, I think that we have a second book coming out. I don't know when you interviewed Orinthia and Chris if they mentioned that. I imagine they did. We have a second book coming out in November, also from Solution Tree, and it's a leader's guide to Little Learners Big Hearts. So the emphasis in that book is very strong on the accountability and the responsibility. Our view is that teachers and especially educational leaders have a responsibility, and that's, I think, a responsibility and accountability are interconnected, have a responsibility to address these issues. Um, and should not be able to give in to their own biases. So one of the things we emphasize in both books, in Little Learners Big Hearts for Teachers, and in the second book, which is called Advancing Empathy and Equity in Early Childhood Education, a teacher no excuse me a leader's guide to Little Learners Big Hearts, we emphasize in both the responsibility that people have to recognize their own biases. So that's why we emphasize in both books the importance of mindfulness, because we believe that each of us is capable of recognizing our own internalized biases. And by recognizing them, and again, this is where that acknowledgement and recognition come in, that we're able to find the courage. I like to say capture the courage because I like alliteration. Capture the courage in ourselves to have the courage to be able to take those difficult steps. So that's sort of at the individual level. Um, and we do have, I mean, I believe that we do have that responsibility if we have some uh, position of authority, and a teacher has that position of authority in a classroom, and an educational leader has that position more broadly over multiple classrooms or within a school district, or whatever the leader might be doing. So that's, I think, where I see that. And I'll just bring in a little bit of a personal anecdote here. Jill Flanders and I, and we've known each other for a while, as I mentioned earlier, participate in a group of five white people who we work together in a social emotional learning organization called SEL for Mass. And we've been together for quite a few years. And we started out as a book group, and eventually we became what we call a white accountability group. Just the initials mean WAG. The idea of affinity groups is kind of the basis of it. So it could be a white affinity group, but we call it a white accountability group because we're emphasizing that by meeting together as white people and we're all educators in some way or another. One person is retired, I'm retired, other people are still a little bit more active. We're addressing what is it that we can do proactively in our working lives, in our family and community lives. It may be just talking to a neighbor. One of the people in the group has said, I have this neighbor who's very racist, and I keep trying to talk to him, and maybe I'm getting through to him a little bit. So that sense of accountability could be in a classroom, it could be in a family, it could be in a community, and that's where how we see our responsibility. But we meet together to share how that's going, what our challenges are, etc. So that's just an example of how both Jill and I have, and I think others have done other things. How Jill and I have approached this issue of accountability as white educators.
And I also like actually the initiative that you're taking, that you also take the courage to actually talk to someone that you really do not agree, right? It's really important because now we live in a world more and more, obviously, with social media, with all these silos that we live in, that we don't even talk to the other person anymore, right? And I think that's what really is and helps us to really have a flourishing together is that we talk also with people that we really do not agree, but at least we accept
Mm-hmm,
them
mm-hmm,
as who they are and help them to maybe see,
mm-hmm.
as you mentioned in the book, see the world through a different window, right? So
Right.
this
Mm-hmm.
takes courage. So, but you might also had some backlash that you actually talk to someone who is really has the very opposite view. How was that?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. So for about so I retired from the main work I was doing, which was consulting and training, about 2 or 3 years ago. But from about the very late 90s, and in several different jobs that I've had, positions I've had, but from about the late 90s until a couple of years ago, so we're talking 23, 24 years, something like that, a lot of what I did was training, consulting with school leadership at state level departments of education, but also at, principals and superintendents and teachers directly. And often when I was training on some of the same kinds of issues that we're talking about here, I had been a principal, so that gave me a little bit of credential to talk to principals. Um, I would often get pushback, and that can be very difficult to deal with. Interestingly, I just wrote a blog for Solution Tree, which has not been posted yet, and it's called "How to Deal with Bias (parenthesis) in yourself, in others, and in yourself." So in that blog, I specifically address what it is that you were just talking about, and give some examples of experiences that I've had in particularly in training others. So the first thing that I say in the blog and that I believe is you have to take a deep breath. So I'll give an example. In the blog, I talk about I was training at a high school not too far from where I live, in a in a city not nearly as big as Boston, but in a city which is probably about 90% families of color, Black, Latino, other groups for other immigrant groups. And so this high school that I was at was training at. I was doing. It wasn't a single training. It was like almost like a class or a course. It was, I think, 6 or 7 sessions. So somewhere in the middle of that, one of the sessions, one of the teachers in the group said, I don't. I think he had been assigned to come. I don't think he really wanted to be there. But he said something to the effect of, "These kids are just lazy, and their parents don't care about education." So right there, you've got a bunch of stereotypes coming out. So one of the things that I suggest in the blog is how the question is, well, how could you as respond, not as a facilitator, which I was, but as another participant, how could you respond to a colleague who says something like that? The first part of that is it's very difficult when you have to work with somebody. It's easier for me to come and go than it is to to uh, to confront a colleague that you're going to be working with, right? So one of the things that I say is take a deep breath or a few deep breaths. First, you have to like find the courage to be able to do this, take a few deep breaths, and then open a dialogue. So you've just said so and so, Jim, you've just said, what repeating what you just said. Can you tell me more about that? And then the person will usually, go in deeper and say, well, this happened, and use examples that they've taken, sort of incidents that they've taken, but not have thought about all the other experiences they've had, let's say, of students who were very, very committed to their education. That person is focusing on the negatives rather than the positive. So, in the conversation and the dialogue with that person expressing bias, what I recommend is an attempt to open their minds a little bit and think about other experiences. And sometimes people have not had other experiences, so you kind of that can be more difficult. But educators usually have had other experiences, but they tend to, because of their own bias lens, they tend to only see the negative and forget about the positive. And so I think the dialogue is a matter of helping somebody think more widely, more broadly, and also saying, well, let's continue to talk about this, and then thinking about ways that you might offer somebody who is biased experiences that might change their mind. And there's a range of ways of doing
That is so crucial. I think this is really important, and also not make feel the other person as he is somehow, just try explore more really what he's meaning by that, and in order for him to actually self and start potentially, self-reflecting on what he just said. And this is
that. Right.
always hard, and I think it applies across culture, is that we also have a tendency, which is really built in our system, right? We want to survive first and foremost. Therefore we usually see first the negative and then more the positive. And it really takes effort to change that, right? You have to take really a lot of energy to look at it a positive way, right? To look at the small wins, whether it's with kids or with your parents, right? And that is something we have to be conscious. It takes effort. But as you just said, it really broadens
Yes.
your perspective, right? It research shows, I think positivity, it was also a book that clearly shows that it really helps to really feel connected, right? Whereas if you're negative, your view just narrows it down. And so this is very important. But I
Yes.
want to touch a little bit more specifically to what we also can do in early childhood in terms of activities.
Hmm.
And you mentioned, and I think now this really gets more and more forgotten, how important play actually is in learning and for the mental development of children. Please elaborate on why you think play is so crucial, and why it's more and more difficult to engage young people in play.
So there are many factors, and we discuss these factors in the book. So one thing to say about play is that in poorer communities, particularly in urban and communities of color, play is not being emphasized enough. It's more what we call skill and drill. Like these kids are, these black children, I'll just use that as an example, are starting way behind the white kids. When they get into school, they have to know their alphabet, and they have to know how to spell their names, and they have to know sort of basic addition, et cetera, et cetera, sort of the early academic skills. Well, you can't spend the whole day doing that and still have time for play. So that's a first consideration, and we document that with a number of pieces of research. I remember there's a quote in the book from a preschool teacher who teaches in an urban environment with mostly children of color, and she's expressing in this quote that we pulled from another article, um, how um, how that sort of approach to just academics and not free play runs counter to brain development. And there's so much research that says that children learn through play. So that's one piece. When you have preschools where they're more diverse, where you have equal numbers of children of color and white children, or even just enough children of color to make it not all white. What comes through play is learning about each other and the development of cooperation. That is so fundamental to the brain. So even if a white child comes from a family where they never, where they don't express racism directly, that white child is still picking up negative um, ideas or negative experiences from the family and community. But if that child is in an environment where they can more freely play with children who are different than them, and here I'm just talking about white children, then it begins to at least perhaps counterbalance some of what the prejudice that they're picking up. And that goes back to what I was saying right at the very beginning of how prejudice develops in the minds of very, very young babies and toddlers and young children. So I think that's just two examples. Um, of the ways in which play is very important for these particular issues that we're talking about. More broadly, for all children, free play, in particular, whether it's blocks or playing out in on playground equipment, or most important, most wonderfully, if children can be out in nature. That's very difficult in um, in an urban environment, but often there are parks that families that teachers can take children to. But even if you don't have access, even if there isn't access to nature, just the ability to play, follow their instincts, learn to resolve conflicts and differences, um, that in itself is just critical, just extremely critical.
Tell us a little bit about your routine. You look incredibly young and you're still super active given your age. So, what do you do in terms of your daily routine that keeps you so healthy and happy, really?
Well, I will be 80 next February, and I just realized my birthday is February 12th, so August 12th was the midpoint of my year. So I'm now closer to 80 than I was to 79 last week. I just thought about that because August 12th is just a few days ago. Um, well, it's a interesting question that you ask. I believe that one of the reasons I've stayed pretty healthy and energetic is that I've been a vegetarian for almost 50 years. I became a vegetarian in 1975. So I haven't eaten meat in 49 years, almost, it'll be 50 years next year. Um, and I think having a diet like that has been very, very important. I do try, like a lot of older people, to stay physically very active and exercise and do all of that. Um, but I think not but, and I think um, I have a very active mind, and like a lot of people my age, I do forget things. It's not dementia, but it's just the normal aging process where there's a word I'm looking for and I just can't find that word. I think it happened a couple of times while we were talking here. Um, and I just have to be patient, and sometimes the word will come to me and sometimes it won't. So I acknowledge that that process is happening. Um, but I think by keeping as active a mind, by keeping my mind so active, um, I think that really helps. So, I read a lot. I'm kind of a news nerd, so I keep up on lots of different news. My children laugh at me because I have so many subscriptions. Like, I subscribe to the Foreign Affairs magazine because I want to know what's happening around the world. I read the New York Times. I read the Washington Post. I read the Boston Globe. I pay too much for subscriptions. but I think it's also that my interest in the world. I have a very supportive family. I have two daughters in their 40s. I have one grandchild. My husband is a writer. He's developing Alzheimer's, so there's a lot of challenges in taking care of him. But even he's a writer, and he still keeps his mind very active. So that's, I think, the kind of those are some of the ways in which I think I've stayed young. I think I look younger because of having been a vegetarian for so many years. Most people do not believe I'm approaching 80. They think I'm more like late 60s or something.
Indeed. What was your most important life lesson that you went through that really helped to further your career to become really this outstanding educationist?
That's such a good question. So this is an odd, I mean, I'm not going back to my childhood. This is in my adulthood. In the 1990s, I was living in New Jersey. And I was at the time still married to my ex-husband, who's the father of my children, and he's from India, from Calcutta or Kolkata, as they call it now. And we were living in a suburban town, and we had a friend who was also from India who was living with us temporarily. And I came out to the car one day, about to, drive away and go to work. And on the car, someone had scribbled with a crayon or something, the N word, "go home." And I um, was stunned. My husband, my ex-husband, came out and said, he said, "Just clean it up." And I said, "No, no, I'm not just going to just clean it up. I'm going to do something about this." So I called the police, local town police. And this policeman came, young man, maybe in his mid to late 20s, and he looked at it and, took some notes from what I was saying. And he said to me, "Ma'am, prejudice is a terrible thing, but we all have to learn to live with it." And I said to him, "You've just said that to the wrong person." And that incident then led to I like to tell that story because if one has a turning point in life or particularly in career, that was my turning point. Because although I had been an educator at the time, I was working, helping to run a computer software business that my ex-husband and I had. I was not, I was not teaching. I was not involved so much with education at that moment in the mid 90s. That then led to my becoming a member of a human relations commission in the county that we lived in, the Camden County Human Relations Commission. That then led to going through a lot of training around community dialogues about race. And eventually, within about 3 or 4 years, I was offered a job working with. I was a principal for a couple of years before this, but I was offered a job working for the state of New Jersey in an office called the Office of Bias, Crime, and Community Relations, and they hired me because they wanted me to work and do trainings in schools. That then led to my focusing on issues around bullying, particularly bias-based bullying. It was early law. I helped to write the first law in New Jersey around bullying. So this was around 92, 93. And then that just one thing led to another after that. So I like to think, I mean, I do think as an adult that moment that child, it turned out to be a classmate of my daughter's at the local middle school. She's now 43, but this is when she was, I don't know how old she was. She was 13 or something. Um, and that was who it turned out was the kid who had written that on our car. So that's my little story about how my life changed at that moment. So I thank that prejudiced, biased little kid because he changed my life, and even more so, I thank that stupid policeman who turned out to be the son of the mayor. The policeman who said that prejudice is a terrible thing, but we need to learn to live with it. His father was the mayor, and the mayor called me and kind of threatened me to not pursue the case. That's my story.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's almost like sounds like every adversity has its equal opportunity, and you really turn it, you know, the right way. So thank you so much for sharing. Last question: what makes you, Randy Ross, feel alive?
I think no different than most people. Family. I have two wonderful daughters. They're partners. My grandson probably is the most important one. He's just started second grade yesterday. They live in California, but I try to see we see each other still. I go there, or they come here 3 or 4 times a year. I talk to him on FaceTime. So I think my answer is not much different than most people. That it's commitment and love of family that keeps me going. And I love my work. And so that's a pretty important part of it.
Randy Ross, thank you so much for being on the show and to be truly a blessing to me and really the world. And to anyone who was listening, let's go to solutiontree.com and grab a copy of Little Learners, Big Hearts. Randy
Thank you so
Ross,
much,
thank you
Yannick,
so
for having
much.
me. I've really enjoyed it.
Randy Ross. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.